Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to welcome back Dr Mustafa Sarkar. Mustafa, welcome back to the show, mate.
Thanks, Dan.
Super excited to have you on. This is your third time you've been on the Sports Psych Show?
It is, yes, third time. I think initially I talked a little bit about individual resilience, and then the second time looking at organisational resilience. So yeah, looking forward to our conversation today.
It's always an honour to have you on, mate, and really excited to explore a few sports psychology topics with you. Why don't you start by introducing yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Thanks, Dan. Will do. So I'm Mustafa Sarkar. I'm an associate professor of sport and performance psychology at Nottingham Trent University. So predominantly my teaching, research and consultancy focuses on individual, team and organisational resilience in elite sport and its application to other high performance domains such as business. But I guess, in relation to today, certainly some of the things that have come through in terms of some of my resilience work is the importance of the environment. And one of the features of the environment that we've started to kind of notice is is in relation to kind of psychological safety. So started to do some work in the area of psychological safety in sport. And as you know, Dan, it's one of my passions is not just doing research for the sake of doing research, but actually doing research that can be applied in practice. So as well as publishing research and presenting research, I work with teams and organizations, athletes, coaches, technical directors, etc., to apply some of this kind of research and practice as well. So looking forward to the conversation today around psychological safety.
Well, you've let the cat out of the bag. We are going to be talking about this term, psychological safety. Before we move on to that, I mean, you mentioned that word environment, and I know from various conversations, various discourse I've had with various sports psychologists over years, various coaches, they'll say that environment is everything. It dwarfs individual psychology. Straight away putting you on the spot, mate. I mean, what do you think of that? Do you think there's a place for individual psychology, or do you think it's all environment? It's not so much what's in your head, it's what your head is in. It's your environment that's vital.
Yeah, I not saying on the defensive. It is a combination of the two. I guess the point that I always make is I think if you focus on the individual, you will probably get some quick wins. You'll probably get some short-term success. But I would probably argue that it's unlikely to lead to any sustained change over a period of time. Whereas I think if you focus on the environment, that will take a lot longer. It's no magic bullet. You're not going to be able to do that kind of overnight or even over a short period of time. And it's going to be a lot harder. But I think it will lead to it has the potential to lead to long-lasting change. So that's probably for me my kind of take on the individual versus the environment.
Yeah, because I know from having conversations with you before on the Sports Psych Show and just in person as well, your work in resilience is multidimensional in as much as you do look at the individual, you do explore whether it's the underpinning personality, the individual factors that relate to somebody's ability to retain a sense of resilience through challenging times. Yet at the same time, that resilience literature that you've built up also encompasses the environment. It's as you say, it's a keen focus on both, isn't it? It's looking potentially as a practitioner, as a coach, as a group of coaches, to look at both, try to create a healthy and safe environment, and try to examine the individual and look to intervene appropriately there.
Yeah, I think if we use, I guess, an individual concept or a very familiar concept, I imagine to listeners around something like motivation. We can do things individually to optimize people's motivation.
Yeah.
But actually, in terms of the environment, there's a lot of work around the idea of the motivational climate, for example. Yeah. So I think I use that example to kind of highlight that, yes, individually you can have an influence on motivation, but I think environmentally as well, you can create that either task or ego-oriented kind of motivational climate that would influence someone's individual motivation. And I think that's the same when it comes to resilience. In our work, when we talk about the environment, we kind of argue that you probably want an environment where there are high levels of challenge and high levels of support. What we call this kind of facilitative environment. We kind of say that if you develop that facilitative environment, you're going to then influence individual personal qualities, the different psychological skills, their different psychological factors, and probably influence how individuals are going to think about and reframe pressure. So, yeah, I think as you say, they go hand in hand. But from a coach point of view, I think that's where obviously the environment, the coach, the management, for example, the environment does play a significant role in terms of how people view pressure, how their experience in that particular kind of sporting context.
You hit the nail on the head when you said motivational climate. I mean, I think that's one area I found in my consultancy practice. It can be bang your head against the brick wall. You can have some real bang your head against the brick wall moments in terms of, you might be working with a club, a team, an organization. You're talking with various players, sometimes all the players, about being more task oriented. You know that they're likely to have an ego orientation. They've been socialized into that. They're looking at win, 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 high perform, better than others. And that's understandable, especially in elite adult environments or developing elite environments. That's understandable. And probably having a healthy amount of that is important and is useful. But I can only speak from my own experience that orienting players towards the task, helping them develop a plan, a framework around a task is so important. And you're doing that, and you're doing that, and you're doing what you feel is some good stuff, and the players are kind of getting it. Only potentially to have a coach or group of coaches constantly communicating around outcome, performance, the ego, as we talk about in motivational climate. I just think you're so spot on. I love individual psychology. It's almost why I got, having been a pro golfer, it was all about an individual sport. It's almost why I got involved in sports psychology in the first place. But over the last 15 years, doing more and more work within organizations, you just absolutely get to understand that you can't fully make the impact that you'd like to without really working with and through the coaching staff to help them align their messages, their feedback, their activities, their approach towards the task, if that's what you're trying to influence.
Yeah, and I think that the challenge, I guess, from a sports psychology profession is that most of our training, probably up until the last 5 or 10 years or so, has focused on individual psychology. I think now there are kind of training routes, or certainly some of the more contemporary training is now focusing on the environment, the culture, the kind of the bigger kind of landscape around that. But I think that's one thing I would, I guess, make sure that coaches, people within sport organisations, being aware of the fact that I think as a profession, sports psychology, I think needs to not necessarily move away from individual psychology, but I think get better at understanding how to operate at that environmental or organisational level, because I think that is very, very different to operating at that individual level.
It's not either or, is it? It's and also. It's and also.
Yeah.
It really is. So we're here today to talk about psychological safety. It's a topic that really interests me. It's something that I haven't necessarily seen enough of within teams, within clubs, and I potentially understand why. So tell me, Muz, tell me about psychological safety. What is psychological safety?
Yeah, so I think as a bit of a starting point, the term was coined by Professor Amy Edmondson, who is from the Harvard Business School. So she coined that term in the 1980s, 1990s. As a slightly an aside as well, more kind of anecdotally, Google did a very, very big project that was called Project Aristotle, and they were looking into high performing teams, and they identified psychological safety as probably the most important feature high-performing teams. So I guess the reason where psychological safety has come from is probably a lot of Amy Edmondson's work, but also probably anecdotally from some of the exposure that Google have had around that. Using Amy Edmondson's kind of viewpoint, I think she would define psychological safety as the perception or belief that a team is safe for interpersonal risk. So whether that's being safe to, or feeling that perception of being safe to ask for help, safe to admit to one's errors, or safe to seek feedback from others. But I think the crucial thing, Dan, is that it's not just about asking for help or taking risk. It's that ability to ask for help and take risk without fear of judgment and retribution. So can you ask for help without fear of judgment? So in the context of sport, everyone can ask for help, but can you ask for help without feeling as if I ask for help, my coach is going to potentially think negatively about me, and that's then going to influence my selection? Similarly, can I take a risk and feel supported that if that risk doesn't pay off, my place in the team is not going to be I'm not going to be second thoughts about whether or not I'm going to be selected or not. So I think it's that perception that the team is safe for interpersonal risk, safe to ask for help, safe to make mistakes, but without that fear of judgment and retribution.
I read a little bit some time ago about the genesis of all of this, stemming from, as you say, Amy Edmondson's work. Her studies back, I think back in the 1990s, studying medical department health practices, and she had this extraordinary discovery that within her data was that the high performing teams within these health practices were the ones who were making the most mistakes. But when you unpacked that, it was actually that they were admitting making the most mistakes. So it wasn't so much that they were making more mistakes, it's just that they were owning up to it. They were having conversations about it. There was, as the name suggests, the safety to talk about it. And as you've just mentioned there, I had also heard that Google had done this investigation and found that a very, very similar tale within their team or departments and teams. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. And so what I hear you say is it's having the capacity or being given the capacity, being given the license to be vulnerable, to talk about the need for help, and to take risks, essentially. Would I be hearing you correctly there?
Yes, I think it's the capacity, but it's also, I would say, I think as the beginning part of the definition talks about, it's that perception and belief that you have that capacity to do so.
Yes.
Or the environment is set up in such a way that you are able to do that without that fear of judgment or retribution. So I think for me, psychological safety is very much an environmental feature, but it's down to that individual perception of that for sure.
There I go down individual again, but it's the environment. It's the perception of
perception of the environment, how the environment is set up for some of these things to occur. So the ability to take risks, the ability, I think, also something that I haven't mentioned is the ability to speak up. To offer your thoughts, to offer your opinions. Without that fear of, okay, someone's going to talk negatively about me if I mention this, let's say in a group meeting or whatever it might be. And I think, I guess one thing to note, Dan, based on the background and as you mentioned, the genesis of this term, there's been a lot of research with Amy Edmondson and other prominent researchers in business and medicine. I guess one thing we've got to be very careful about, particularly if we're moving this into the context of sport, is psychological safety is a context-specific construct. So just because we're starting to find, obviously, a lot of the research in business, for example, has found that psychological safety and all its kind of underpinning features leads to better innovation, better decision making, and then the opposite, being unsafe, leads to a bit of a blame culture, people less likely to share different views, etc. And that's I guess why the concept has started to grow in popularity. But I think moving it to the context of sport, I know we're going to talk about things around the influence of power and things like that. Those very vague sport specific contextual considerations. Even though there are lots of similarities between sport and business, there are actually some kind of differences as well. So I think as a area, we've just got to be careful about just automatically assuming that the findings in business automatically transfer to the sport context.
Do you think that's what's happened? Do you think some voices have sort of pushed this? And
I think, from my view, I don't think it's happened, but I think some people think that that's what's happening. That people are automatically just similar to resilience being a bit of a buzzword. Psychological safety has now started to become a bit of a buzzword. People are jumping onto the concept, and I think actually the wrong assumption that it's being translated without any critical thought. I think as researchers and practitioners, people are realizing that psychological safety is context specific. But I think there is that kind of wrong assumption that, it's automatically being translated, which I don't think it is. But I think we just need to be mindful of that, I guess, as we're moving forward.
Yeah, and as a consultant embedded within various teams, clubs, organisations over the last decade, and this information emerged and came into my conscious awareness, it resonated with me, because I was experiencing working with players who were fearful about being vulnerable, about talking with coaches around what they're experiencing, the negative thoughts, the feelings, the anxieties, the low mood, the doubt, the worry. With the old chestnut of, well, I'm never going to get picked if I actually admit to low confidence, or that I'm feeling anxious at the moment, or some form of sort of psychological construct is actually getting in my way. So it resonated with me straight away. So whilst I looked around and thought, yeah, okay, I'll pick up an Amy Edmondson book, and it's all from organisations, the stories, the anecdotes, and Google is this global organisation. At the same time, it completely resonated in terms of what I was experiencing and what I continue to experience within sports teams.
Yeah, and I think for me that also rings, and it rings true for me as well. Certainly the talks that I've done or spoken to coaches and management around this concept, I think it definitely does have direct transfer to the world of sport. I think, it's just being mindful that of just some of the kind of the contextual kind of considerations that I guess it's not necessarily the principles per se that are at question. It's more about how you might apply some of those principles that might differ from context to context. And particularly, we'll probably go on to talk a little bit about this in terms of the role and influence of power. But I think certainly, particularly when we talk about elite sport is inherently unsafe. And we're probably never going to get to that stage where we're going to make elite sport psychologically, fully safe. So actually, in the context of elite sport, part of it is about developing psychological safety, but also part of it, in my view anyway, it's about managing and recognizing the unsafe aspects of the environment, and then doing something to be able to manage those specific aspects. It's not necessarily about making everything safe, but it's sometimes managing some of those unsafe areas or unsafe aspects.
And by recognizing those unsafe elements, and by striving to manage those unsafe elements, we give ourselves a better chance to have a safer environment. Never going to be 100% safe, because what is in life, but we might chip away at that environment becoming safer. It might become a safer environment perhaps for a player to be able to express vulnerability, to take a risk in terms of being, well, a little bit more involved in the day-to-day running and activity of the team and the organization, speaking up when they don't like something that's happening, a decision that's been made, a policy that's been put through, a rule, a guideline, something like that.
Yeah.
So let's explore this power threat relationship, because I'm sure a big part of it in sport is being able to cut through that power threat relationship, being able to turn down the volume of power. Because when you walk the corridors of teams, especially when we're really talking about elite sport here, developing elite, but I suppose it could be said to a degree grassroots sports, because there's always going to be a coach athlete power threat relationship potentially in a divide. When you walk through the corridors of elite sport, then you really do feel that power is in place. You really do feel the difference between the coach and the athlete, what one can and can't do. Talk to me a little bit about this power. Can we reduce this power at all? Can we lessen this threat at all?
Yeah, really, I think it's a really nice starting point. And I guess the first thing I should mention is power as an area. It has lots of it's been stemmed from sociology, from coaching. I'm not an expert in power. I've developed that knowledge and understanding. And I guess as a starting point, I want to kind of thank when I first heard about power and its relation to psychological safety. Chris Marshall and Rebecca Symes in particular did a really interesting talk last year where I kind of developed my understanding of power. But then also most recently, Dr. Tom Leader, who's a lecturer in coaching at the University of Essex, did a great talk around power. And I guess one thing I picked up from his talk was the fact that, I guess as a starting point, Dan, if we want to reduce perceptions of power, I think those in positions of power need to have an awareness of what power they hold. So I guess, based on some work that Tom talked about in a talk, it was based on French and Raven in the 1950s. There are many aspects of power. I'm going to talk about just three in particular. But the first thing he talked about was this idea of expert power. And that's where, as an expert, you have the knowledge or the perception of knowledge. So, in the context of football, that might be someone who is an ex-pro, who is a coach, or someone who has got lots of, some of the highest coaching qualifications. They hold expert power. You've then got informational power, and that's where, for example, that's to do with the strength of the argument. And that's where, for example, athletes buy into a particular approach or a particular philosophy. And if someone buys into that approach or philosophy, that person is holding that informational power. And then lastly, you've got this idea of referent power, which is where athletes might identify, let's say, with a coach because they're well liked, they've got lots of charisma. And then as a result, that individual holds referent power, that personality, I guess. So those are only three aspects that I've kind of, it's resonated with me in terms of I can see that translation to sport. But I think for me, that's the starting point, is coaches, senior management realizing that, okay, I might have expert power. I might have that informational power. I might have that referent power. And once you're aware of the type of power you might hold, you're then, I think, in a better position to then reduce some of those perceptions. And I've got a few ideas potentially, but yeah, I think as a starting point, Dan, for me, it's that awareness of power. And then using that as a basis to then understand how you might reduce that perception.
I think it's so fascinating because those three you've given us there, expert power, informational power, referent power, would potentially be seen as, these are things that are seen as advantageous. That's what, in many respects, coaches are working so hard to, they're working hard to develop their knowledge base. They're working hard to have the kind of game plans and utilizing principles of play to outfox the opposition. So we want these informational pieces of power. Referent power, I'm just thinking about, these days you read articles and you think, articles, journalists will talk about, well, that person could be a good manager maybe because they know a lot about the game, but they haven't quite got the charisma. It's all about the charisma now, which feels like has a relationship with referent power, that extrovert, that leader that asserts themselves through their personality, and they drive everybody through their personality. So it's really interesting in terms of, and I completely agree. I reflect back and I think about the coaches I've worked with, the brilliant coaches, and you can almost say what helps them also hinders them. Their brilliance can also bring them enormous challenges, and one of those is that power threat relationship. It's fascinating, mate.
I think exactly what you said. I think it definitely has certain advantages, but I guess in the context of psychological safety,
Yeah,
the threat to that is that if you are holding those areas of power, does that then potentially mean that athletes are potentially less likely to disagree with your viewpoint? Are they less likely to try new things, take risks? Are they less likely to speak up in a conversation? So I think the one example I often give in terms of power, I think, is, let's say, as coaches, whether or not I think coaches are aware of this, but selection. Coaches have that power to either select or deselect a player, and as a result, that has massive ramifications about players putting on a bit of a front. They're obviously kind of mind reading, jumping to conclusions about what potentially coaches are saying, their body language, for example. So I think in terms of reducing that perception of power, body language, I think, for me, is a massive thing about coaches being aware of what they're doing, not just verbally, but also non-verbally in terms of some of their body language, but also some of their verbal communication, the language and communication around certain things. I think the other area, which again Amy Edmondson talks about, not necessarily in the context of power, but just talks about more broadly, I think for those in positions of power, being able to acknowledge your fallibilities, being able to acknowledge, hold up your hand and say, I've got this wrong here, or I've made a mistake, or I made this mistake and I'm going to take on your feedback in relation to those certain things, or your ability to ask questions as a leader to gauge the feedback of other people. And I think ultimately for me, Dan, we're going to talk about, I guess, different areas when considering to develop psychological safety, but particularly for those in positions of power, the ability to role model the behaviors that you want, I think, is absolutely crucial. So yeah, I think acknowledging some of your being vulnerable yourself as a leader or a coach, thinking about your body language, thinking about your language, your actual verbal language and communication. I think are loads different areas to consider in terms of reducing those perceptions of power.
it sounds scary. I'm sure if I put myself in the shoes of a, let's say, I'll go right to the top here, say in the world of soccer, football, put myself in the shoes of the boots of a Premier League manager. And they're sort of thinking, well, hang on, I've got these 25 players who are multimillionaires. Is it actually a good thing for me to express vulnerability? Is it a good thing for me to demonstrate fallibility, that I don't know it all? It feels like it's that fear of doing that holds them back, from even beginning to engage here, that they feel like they can't be seen to be demonstrating any kind of fallibility. I can, again, mate, I completely agree with you. And I think done skillfully, even just subtly, which I think are the kind of things that you're alluding to, rather than a coach going, "Yeah, I don't really know the answer there." It's probably done in a slightly more
Yeah.
subtle, complex, and nuanced manner. But I having been in those environments, I understand why coaches can be fearful of that, because there's almost this perception of competence as well, isn't there? I'm in this position because I'm competent, and I want my players to feel that I'm competent. And so subsequently, if I start to reduce that notion of competence, then I might lose them.
Yeah. And I think that's where I said, we said at the beginning about understanding the context of sport. And this is where, some of
Yeah.
these principles have come from business. It doesn't always directly translate to the context of sport. And I fully agree with you there that I think if we give the message to coaches to say, just always just admit when you're wrong, it's not going to work, and it might actually have the actual negative, or might have the opposite effect that you're actually desiring. But I would say, and this is for me, that psychological safety question that I always get a lot of the time is basically, where do you start? If you want to develop psychological safety, what's your kind of first starting point?
Yeah.
Now, in some cases, acknowledging fallibility might not be the most natural starting point, because that requires an environment already to be set up where there is that environment where people are able to do that. So that might not necessarily be the first starting point in terms of reducing that perception of power.
Yeah.
It could be initially around the body language that we've talked about. One other thing I would say in the context of sport is, we might talk about this later around meetings. A lot of meetings happen in sport, and I think a lot of meetings is a place where power does come about who's leading the meeting, who's chairing that meeting. A simple thing like player-led meetings, that in itself is a great way as a starting point. It might not be appropriate for all contexts, but player-led meetings is a nice way to spread that leadership, where actually then everyone then becomes accountable for what's going on, rather than all the accountability going on to the coach or the captain, as an example. So yeah, I think there are many ways. Acknowledging fallibility might not be the starting point if the environment is not set up in that way to start off with. But I think, and as you said, it has to be subtle. But I think over a period of time, I think we do want to get into that position where people are vulnerable enough to share emotion, but also to develop. I guess ultimately, the reason why we know it's important is because it will then help to develop better relationships. And ultimately, I would say sport is a people-driven, business. So I would say that, yeah, over a period of time, you might be in a place to be able to do those things a little bit more comfortably.
I love what you're saying, and it's made me reflect on, well, where do you start with psychological safety? Because I think it's a really interesting question. You've mentioned there acknowledging fallibility. That I, as your head coach, I, as your manager, I'm not always right. I'm going to get things wrong. And there are plenty of head coaches, managers who would hold their hands up plenty of times, I'm sure, during the season and say, yeah, I just didn't quite get the tactics right there. I think we do live in a world now that is more inclined to be like that. As you were speaking there, I was thinking of one entrance point being normalizing negative emotion, vulnerability, anxiety, worry, doubt.
Yeah.
That head coach or the coaches or the manager helping players, giving players a platform to normalize, to talk about anxiety, to normalize it, that we're not robots, we're human beings, and that we are going to experience these emotions. They are going to get in the way sometimes. I could think that's got to be a powerful entrance point.
I think so. Certainly one of the principles I talk about, I guess for me, Daniel, when it comes to emotions, it's twofold. It's giving the space, and I think it's giving some prompts. I guess to elaborate on that a little bit further, I guess when it comes to the space aspect, I just think with the nature of elite sport, with it being so high paced, you've got the game. Using the context of football, you've got a game on Saturday. You potentially then get a game on the Wednesday. The opportunity for debrief. You might debrief technically and tactically. I always just think from a psychological point of view, particularly when it comes to emotions, right after the end of a game is not the best opportunity for that kind of debrief. And then often what happens is you move on to you're training then in preparation for the next game without actually taking that time to actually emotionally debrief.
Yep.
So I think initially giving that space for that emotional debrief, if you want to even call it decompression, to happen.
Yep.
But then also the other thing I would say is prompts in the environment where people then feel safe and they are given the opportunity to express emotion.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's a twofold thing. It's the space, but also the prompt and the opportunity to do that.
And with that, do you think that I mean, obviously, when I ask this question, I appreciate that this is going to be talking about the very elite where clubs have got resources for, say, sports psychologists. But do you think that can happen through the coaches, that they can create the space, they can prompt? Do you think that ideally has to happen through the sports psychologist? What's your thoughts there?
I guess, again, not sitting on the fence here, but I guess I would say that that's context
Yep.
specific. I think if it's appropriate to do that through the sports
Yep.
psychologist, I think definitely there's a role to play in the sports psychologist to help create that environment where space and prompts are there. But I would also say the one advantage of potentially doing it with the coach, it goes back to, for me, about role modeling.
Yeah.
So if the coach also, um, with players or maybe with other staff, I should say that actually when we're talking about this, we're not just talking about players, we're also giving staff the opportunity to share and express emotion. Um, if coaches are doing it themselves and they're role modeling that and they're integrating that as part of their training or their kind of their periodization, etc., then I would say that then yes, that there is definitely advantages of doing it through the coach, because I think if players then see that the coaches are doing that, they're probably more likely to then buy in to, okay, if coaches are doing that, that gives me the, in inverted commas, I don't like using this word, but it gives me the permission to also do that as well. Going back to the idea of power, in terms of the power that coaches hold over this. So, yeah, I think there's definitely scope to do it both ways for sure.
Engaging in fallibility, normalize vulnerability. I suppose role modeling. Another thing I've written down here is autonomy supportive coaching, um, giving players the opportunity to get involved, to contribute, to be participants and not just recipients, is surely an entrance point.
Yes, and I think particularly one of the areas that we might get on to talk about is this idea of promoting calculated risks. Or kind of obviously one of the areas of psychological safety is around this idea of risk taking. And I think that's where potentially, that autonomy supportive aspect becomes really important. It's not just about coaches exposing athletes themselves to risk, but actually getting the viewpoint of athletes themselves to say, from your point of view, from your own individual development point of view, what do you need in the environment to challenge yourself even further? It's not about coaches forcing or exposing them and it being a one way message. It's about actually athletes themselves being proactive to think, putting themselves in challenging situations, and potentially also getting coaches that kind of two-way communication with the coach to say, okay, if I want to put myself in challenging situations, what kinds of things can we do? How can I experiment, try new things, etc.? So I would agree. I think autonomy support as a concept fits in quite nicely with it.
As you're speaking there, again, it almost comes back to the fear factor, doesn't it? They're always treading a fine line, aren't they, coaches, in terms of, again, I'm a coach, I have an expertise. I'm leading this team. I want them to play using, this kind of game model that utilizes these principles of play. At the same time, I do want them to participate. I do want players to participate. I want them to contribute because I know that that's going to give them a greater feeling of safety. It's going to give them the feeling of involvement. It's going to engage them. All these things are so important. But what you don't want is a player saying something so ridiculous about the game model and the principles of play. I don't know what that could be, but just something that just doesn't work. And then subsequently you find yourself as a coach having to say, okay, I see where you're coming from, but actually I'm not so sure that's going to work.
Yeah, and funnily enough, Dan, the one caveat with all of this actually is, and there's a really, really good point there. I think so. Firstly, I guess in relation to that point, I think there needs to be some boundaries set in terms of how that actually works in practice. Around, the coach might kind of say, "We want your viewpoint," but it might be constrained around certain aspects of it. But I think the key bit that you've mentioned there, and I make this point with psychological safety, is that actions speak louder than words. Language and communication is really important. So you might, for example, tell players, we want you to take risks, we want you to try new things, and then actually when they do that in a game, the next time that they're going to be on, they're going to be deselected because they tried something that the coach told them to try, but actually then those actions from the coach hasn't then matched with what they've said. So I think you're right there that there needs to be that kind of I call it the alignment, really, that alignment between if you're going to ask for something, you need to then support, follow the whole way through with not just your words but also with your actions and behaviours. And I appreciate that's a lot easier said than done. But I think if you just use words and then the behaviours don't follow up, I think that's where you might lose players. In terms of their ability to think, okay, they're saying that we want psychological safety, but actually they don't necessarily mean it in inverted commas.
I can just imagine a coach piping up and going, well, I said you could take some risk, but not that type of risk. That's crazy risk. Yeah. Don't do that.
But I think that's where I guess that's where the boundaries do need to be. I think that's where that kind of, those honest and open and honest conversations about, okay, what risk might look like. What kinds of risks are they kind of looking for? I wouldn't go as far as saying what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, but just trying to provide some boundaries around that, so that when there is that kind of debrief, coaches can have those conversations to say, we want to take risks, but this may be not the type of risk we were looking for. Can we then frame it, or can we kind of reframe it to the next time to say, okay, can we look at doing it in a slightly different way? So I think having those open and honest conversations for me are really, really important.
And I think there's a lot of interaction here, isn't there, in terms of, when I think of autonomy supportive, a coach might say, well, I want to conduct meetings whereby I give players the opportunity to contribute. But ultimately, again, if we're referring to borders and boundaries here, ultimately, I'm the key decision maker. I'm the person who's going to be laying down the game plan in accordance to the principles of play that I've laid out. But yeah, absolutely. If you're sticking to that framework, then please, I don't know everything about this. You might see something that I don't know. So we come to the fallibility piece there.
Yeah. I guess being mindful though, Dan, I guess it does go back to language, communication, phrasing. I guess if a coach were to say, I'm obviously the one who's going to be deciding game plan, that goes back to that perception of power. And then as a result of that, even if it's a player-led meeting, do then players feel as if some of their input is being heard in terms of that process? Or do they feel that player-led meetings, we can say anything we want in those meetings, but the coach is not necessarily going to take on any of that feedback? So it is a real fine line, and it's something that will happen probably through a bit of experimentation and trying things out. But I think it's a difficult one to kind of think about in terms of language and communication, how you get that message across to say, yes, I'm the one at the end of the day who is deciding things, but at the same time I still want your contribution. It's a real difficult one to have in terms of that, because I think if you give the message that I'm still going to be one deciding game plans, does that still mean that players may not communicate the things that they've got actually on their mind?
I just think it's endlessly fascinating, and I think it's fascinating with reference to some of the conversations we all have maybe on social media, and some of the things that put up, and I put stuff up, and we talk about the importance of autonomy supportive coaching. But you still want, you probably still want expertise. You still want a coach to have a great degree of expertise around the kind of things that are going to help to win games, if we're talking about the elite level side of the game, or help players learn and grow. And I suppose the words hovering over my mind at the moment is negotiation. I don't want to get too much off topic here, but I just wonder if that encompasses some kind of negotiation, and again incorporates the linguistic skills of the coach to be able to accommodate player feedback, players taking risk, offering, participating, but at the same time the coach drawing some borders and boundaries in terms of, yes, great, fantastic, please contribute, but this also has to make logical sense. This has to apply to the logic of the game. This has to help us
Yeah.
succeed to win. Let's negotiate. Let's look at this. Let's talk about this.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think the word negotiation fits in really nicely. I think with the area of psychological safety for sure.
Just fascinating stuff, Muz. And I know that you've contributed to a really important document by leaders in sport around psychological safety that details how coaches, if they want to incorporate psychological safety into their coaching environment, they can do. And the document sort of reports 7 considerations that coaches, leaders can have when considering psych safety. What are some of those considerations? For the coaches listening in, what should they be thinking about when striving to incorporate psychological safety?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to note, Dan, is obviously in the report itself, it talks about 7 considerations. It's not necessarily constrained to 7. It's not necessarily there isn't a kind of a magic list of or kind of a set number, so to speak. But yeah,
Yeah.
these are just some areas that coaches and leaders might want to consider when they're looking to shape the environment. I guess if we just start with the first one that's mentioned in the report, the title of it is it's about social skills, not mental skills. And I guess it goes back to the conversations that we've had earlier about not necessarily moving away from psychological skills or individual skills, but recognizing the importance of building relationships, those social skills. And I guess within that consideration, something I talk about is shifting cultures to be more relational rather than outcome. Um, and then also getting to know the person behind the performer. So whether that's your staff member, whether that's an athlete, I think for me, yes, that first consideration is about the importance of relationships, building and developing those social skills, getting to know the individual first as a person rather than a performer, and then I think that leads or links in to then shifting that culture to be more relational. And that's not to say that we know that, particularly in the context of elite sport, outcome is important. But I would say combining both relational outcomes, performance outcomes, and I think at the end of the day, when we're talking about elite sport, it is about collaboration, and the best way to do that is building good relationships. So yeah, understanding the person behind the performer, I think, is a nice way to start.
I love that. And what I'm thinking here as you're speaking, I'm thinking of psychologically informed environments. I'm thinking of coaches sitting down, considering the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences, the the personalities of the people in their coaching environment. And I love what you've said there in terms of that's a grounding, that's a starting point to considering the relationships between the players, the people, everybody, I suppose, the collaboration there, and emphasizing the relational piece, emphasizing the collaboration over and above the outcome. And we almost go back to the motivational climate there, don't we? The task. Okay, the task isn't exactly the same as the person behind the performer, but it aligns nicely with that task rather than ego. And then we let the performance and the outcomes kind of take care of themselves.
Yeah, and I guess just one simple thing in terms of getting to know the person behind the performer. I guess if you think about it as on pitch and off pitch, you might know that you might know them as a performer on the pitch in terms of what they're bringing, their strengths, technically, tactically, psychologically, physically. But actually, are you also aware as a coach or a leader about them as individuals off the pitch as well? Because I think that will then also help to understand how to get the best out of them as an individual and also being able to build better relationships with them as well. So I think for me, that's a nice, simple way of thinking about it is thinking about them off pitch as well as on pitch.
It's the in between. It's the in between that's important. It's the communication, it's the relationships, it's the collaboration. Yep, I love it. I love it, mate. I think that's such a, and I almost wonder if it goes over and above psychological safety. It's just modern day coaching. How do we see our team? How do we see our organisation? It's a collaborative outfit. We work together to find solutions. We work together to incorporate what we want to incorporate. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, in terms of the second area that's again mentioned in the report, we talk about the value in conversational turn taking. That's just a fancy phrase from Google. So one of the things that Google talked about it was conversational turn taking and what they called ostentatious listening. And that's just
Okay.
fancy academic
No,
jargon.
I like it.
That's just
Yeah.
fancy academic jargon to say take turns in terms of having conversation, but then also show that you are listening. The whole idea of ostentatious listening is not just, you know, in one ear out the other ear, but you're actually showing the other person in that meeting, whether that's for your body language, simple thing as, nodding your head, um, the body language that you're showing. And I guess the reason I say that, Dan, is we had this conversation early on about meetings. I don't know if there's any research behind this, but we've all been in meetings before where the chair of the meeting or the person who's holding that meeting, within the first 10 minutes, they're the only person who's made some conversation. And I'd always say if someone has spoken for 5 or 10 minutes without giving anyone else the opportunity to say something, the likelihood of someone then saying something later down the line significantly reduces. I don't know what the percentage is or if there's any research to kind of back that up, but I'm sure there has been something to say that if someone doesn't speak within the first 5 minutes of a meeting, the chances of them people inputting are significantly reduced. Um, I'm sure we've all been in meetings before where you've got something in your mind, particularly in bigger group meetings, you've got something in your mind and your inner voice is saying, should I say this? If I say this, this is going to come across as really silly. I'm going against what the coach is saying if I say this. And I think this idea of conversational turn taking and ostentatious listening just basically ensures that people then are safe to contribute, to speak up, to share their opinion, to share their viewpoint. Um, we've talked about player-led meetings. That's obviously one way of doing that. But I think, the idea of giving everyone in a meeting, obviously it's more geared towards smaller meetings, but giving everyone the opportunity to say something. And then as the leader or the person in power maybe holding that meeting, showing that you're listening to their viewpoints. Not necessarily agreeing with everything, but showing that you're listening.
I love what you're saying because it's making me think of having a process to a meeting. I think definitely as sports psychologists, or maybe just me as a sports psychologist, one can be guilty of saying, well, we need to have player-led meetings or we need to have players involved in some capacity. The challenge then is, well, what does that actually look like? And that can look quite grim at times in terms of silence and not much interaction, and perhaps when there can be interaction, there can be sarcasm or unpleasantness, potentially. But what I love about what you're saying there, if you can get buy-in, and perhaps one might not use these terms, but I get the use of these terms, by having that process, and essentially you're upskilling people in terms of how one conducts effective meetings, essentially, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that's what I say. Player-led meetings is one example. It might not work in your specific context. It might be too soon to do something like that. But I think definitely some reflection on the process and structure of meetings. Meetings are part and parcel of sport. So basically, how can you get the best out of meetings? I think ultimately that's what it's about: is what can you do to make the best out of the meetings, so people are feeling safe to say what they want, and also they're able to challenge one another without that fear of
Yeah.
retribution, and they're able to share different viewpoints. Because I think sometimes with meetings, everyone, we've all seen this before, that Churchill kind of nodding the head to every point, but actually in your mind you're probably thinking something completely different. But are you able then to challenge that, in a safe environment? And I think it's just, yeah, as you said, not nicely. I think the word process and structure. How can you process and structure meetings where people are comfortable to share their viewpoints?
Well, I can assure you, mate, as I'm nodding my head, as you can see, I'm not thinking of anything else other than I agree. So please be assured of that. Give us one more, Muz, if you can. Give us one more sort of consideration that coaches should align with.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this kind of this, or alluded to this already to some extent. But one of the things that's talked about is the idea of promoting calculated risks. And I guess for me here, it's not only kind of promoting kind of calculated risk. We've talked about this before around the boundaries and setting some of those boundaries around that. Um, you might consider as a coach, you might consider how you frame or respond during a training session. So it could be as simple as, in this training session, we're going to be trying something new, and as a result, you're going to be making mistakes, and that's very, very normal. That's very, very natural, and there's nothing wrong about that at all. We want to encourage that ability for you to try something different. So coaches will always provide a session, rationale or justification. But I think doing that not only from a technical and tactical point of view, but also from a psychological point of view,
Yeah.
framing that session to say, it's going to be a session where we're going to take risk. That might mean you're going to make your odd mistake, but that's absolutely fine. That's what we're expecting that. And then as I said, I think then being mindful of communication and language around risk and failure. One of the examples that I often give in relation to psychological safety is a quote that's been attributed to Gareth Southgate. And probably Gareth Southgate's probably not realizing this from a psychological safety point of view. But this was a quote post-match in the last friendly game prior to the World Cup, where England played Costa Rica, and Marcus Rashford scored this absolutely brilliant goal. And in the post match conference, Gareth Southgate said, "We want players to be making mistakes, because when they're making mistakes, it means that they're trying things, and that might mean the odd failure, but then we get what he called, in inverted commas, these wow moments." And these wow moments was one of the wow moments he was talking about was specifically in relation to this Marcus Rashford goal. And that's what I mean, I guess, specifically around language and communication. He's giving the impression off that actually making mistakes is absolutely fine because it means you're trying things. He goes on to say that it might mean there's an odd failure, which again is reinforcing the point that actually that odd failure is absolutely okay. But it also goes back down to what we said previously about it's not just the fact that Gareth Southgate uses these words, he then backs that up with his actions in terms of constantly or consistently selecting younger players, even when, let's say, for example, they might have taken risks, and some of those risks might not necessarily have paid off. But it's because they've gone with the philosophy of what he wants to be achieving as part of his team. I use the example of Saka as an example. There's probably been a couple of games where he's tried things, not paid off. He might have been subbed off in games from a technical and tactical point of view, but then Southgate's then given him the opportunity later on because he can see he's playing without freedom, playing without creativity, etc. So for me, that's promoting calculated risks is about setting up those training sessions, thinking about how you frame and respond during sessions, but then it's also about the language and communication that you use, and then making sure that your actions and behaviors are aligned and match up with the words that you say.
So important if we think about. I mean, we're being quite football, soccer heavy here today, but it's just when I'm sure basketball coaches listening in can relate it to basketball teams, maybe their team. Tennis coaches to tennis, that we all want our athletes to engage in approach behaviors, to focus on what they want to play. If I was to use the terms with freedom, as you've said, or on the front foot, which not everybody loves those terms, but I think they align nicely with approach behavior. Really interesting moves, because then we're almost going full circle. Well, how do we align psychological safety with sport? Where is, because there are problems, aren't there? There are challenges like we've talked about. Well, the coach is the decision maker, and the coach as expert and knowing the principles of plays and the game models, and so there are challenges to bring in psychological safety. However, I do wonder if what you're saying here is this really is a low hanging fruit here, because no matter the sport you engage in, it's you've got to engage in approach behavior to execute with a positive intent. If I'm a golfer, I want to execute a swing with confidence and not with inhibition. If I'm a footballer, as you're mentioning there, well, I mean, contextually, England football is very, very much, this is where this is so important for England football to say, well, we want players who are going to take risks, to play front foot, to play quick football, for instance, and to make quick decisions, and they might make mistakes. So I don't know. I'm kind of thinking that this risk-taking element is really when we align it with how we play, the way we want to engage in our behaviours in our sporting environments. This is where psychological safety, I think, is so aligned with, so impactful for sport and for coaches.
Yeah, and I think one point to mention, actually, because I know we were talking about this earlier on, was that boundary setting around taking risks, and when do you how do you potentially set those boundaries? I came across this tweet from Adam Grant. Adam Grant being a really famous occupational organizational psychologist, and what he's just brilliant at is translating some quite complex science into really practical messages. And what he tweets quite often about psychological safety. And I came across something quite recently where he said that when failure is caused by deviance and negligence, that's a performance problem to manage. But when failure is a result of an experiment to explore an idea or test a hypothesis, it's a learning opportunity to reward. And he has this continuum where failure is either blameworthy or praiseworthy. And I think for me, it's just a really nice idea to say, we talk about failure often, promoting risks, but also encourage, getting people to try new things, make mistakes. Inevitably, that might lead to some failure. But I think that's where it goes back to, as a coach, as a leader, if that failure has come from because people either haven't paid attention to certain processes in place, that's then something that needs to be managed. Whereas actually, if that failure has come because they've tried to experiment, they've tried to take a risk, they've tried to test something in the boundaries that you've allowed, then I think actually that's something that needs to then be further reinforced. So I think hopefully that just provides some guidance really around how you might promote risk taking and potentially manage an inverted commas failure.
Really interesting. Really interesting. What's the future, mate? Where are we going with psychological safety?
Yeah, I guess for me, if we break it down into kind of two areas, I guess for me, from a research point of view, we've talked about this before, the fact that most of the research so far in this space has been in the business context. So I think before we can start to make some definitive applied recommendations in the sport context, I think there needs to be far more research in the sport area. As an example, I've got two kind of PhD researchers who are doing some research in this space. Sally Hilton, who is looking at psychological safety, the relationship between psychological safety, fear of failure, and resilience in a national sport organisation. Right. Because I think we need to now understand the relationship between psychological safety and other areas as well. And then another PhD researcher who's supervised actually by Dr. Carl Paradis at the University of Ulster, Michael Cook. He's actually in the process potentially of developing a sport-specific measure of psychological safety. So again, Amy Edmondson has developed a measure of psychological safety that's used quite widely. But again, we found that from some of our own work that it's not necessarily sport-specific. So from a research point of view, those are just two areas, but there's lots more research that needs to be done more broadly around understanding the relationship between psychological safety and other important constructs, I guess. Yeah. How does psychological safety relate to performance? How does psychological safety relate to well-being, as an example? I guess then from an applied point of view, what will be really interesting is I would say, 5 years or so ago, we weren't really talking about psychological safety. It's now become this buzzword because of what we've talked about so far. What I think will be really interesting is, will psychological safety just become part of the fabric?
Yep.
I would hope that at the end of the day that we don't actually need to use the term psychological safety to determine some of these things. These are just good principles around developing good quality environments. So hopefully in the next kind of 5 years or so, it becomes part of the fabric. I think the interesting conversation will be, and again, I know as sports psychs, Dan, we don't like having this conversation around performance versus well-being as an example. But I think the whole idea of psychological safety, the impact on performance, the impact of well-being. I think if we were to sell this in inverted commas to sport teams and organisations, I think from an applied point of view, we need to be able to have some of these concrete, areas. And I guess probably thirdly, based on things that we were talking about off air, I think some cultural differences around some of this work. We're talking about psychological safety very much from a westernized perspective, but we're talking about power, we're talking about feedback, we're talking about making mistakes. In a westernized world, power is very, very different to maybe how coaches are viewed in places, let's say in the Far East or in other areas. So I think the translation of some of these principles in other non-Western cultures, I think, is another really interesting future avenue, both from a research point of view, but also from an applied point of view as well.
Absolutely fascinating stuff, mate. Really interesting. And I'd be keen to get you back on, and maybe with one or a couple of your PhD students to discuss the specifics of their research. I just think there's so much to unpack there. And I suppose a final thought from me, and would like to get your comment on this. As you say, what does this look like in 5 years' time? Because okay, they're different concepts, but things, popular terms and approaches have come in, like mindset and deliberate practice and things like that people now quibble about and kind of adhere to, and they've kind of stayed on the scene, but it's how does psychological safety interact with other elements, other things, other psychological constructs, outcomes, performance, etc. That, to me, how does it fit in, and how does it relate to, and how does it interact with everything else around it? I wonder if that's what we've got to look at and decipher for it to really stick around and positively impact our coaching environments from both a performance and a well-being perspective, right?
Yeah, and there are only, talking about the fact that those, the importance of understanding some of those relationships between psychological safety and other concepts. There are only currently 3 specific research papers that have actually directly looked at psychological safety in the context of sport. And we're sort of starting to get a bit of a sense. Some of the work that we did in 2000 last year, for example, with Catherine Franson and Desi McEwen, found that the importance of identity leadership and the impact that psychological safety can have on team performance and team well-being in terms of preventing things like burnout, for example. There's also been some research by Jyoti Josai, Sophia Jawa, who I know you've had onto the Sport Psych show as well. She's started to found the importance of relationship quality being a really important antecedent to psychological safety. And then there's been some researchers from Canada, Colin McLaren, Kevin Spink, who've looked at the impact of psychological safety on the communication cohesion relationship, as an example. So I guess as the reason I'm mentioning all of those things is I think we're starting to make some movement to understand it, but literally we're just at the kind of the cusp of it. I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done. The last thing I would say, well, there's 2 things I want to say, Dan, is I guess for me, psychological safety is one. We asked that question before about where do we start, and I guess regardless of where you start, all I would say is within your team and organization, start to make some small changes. I think when we think about all of these really, really big principles that we've talked about, start to make small changes in the right direction. And then ultimately, when you bring together smaller changes, it might lead to some longer lasting, more definitive changes. So I think start somewhere rather than thinking this is too big an area to focus on. Even if it's to make one small change in terms of what you're doing. Let's say, going back to what we talked about previously about the way that you structure a meeting. That's such a small change that you could potentially make that might have a knock-on effect on some of these other things. So make I think for me, crucially, make small changes can actually have quite a big impact. The second thing I want to highlight really is there's been a lot of commentary, I think, on social media. I've kind of heard about it where people are incorrectly um, making the assumption that where people who are interested in psychological safety, the likes of myself and others, where they're incorrectly claiming that we're saying that psychological safety is going to answer everything. It's the panacea to everything. And that's just not true. Psychological safety is one concept. It's one area that I think is valuable, that the research highlights as valuable. But no one is saying that, by developing psychological safety, you're automatically going to be creating high performing teams. It's part of the recipe, but it's not the full picture. And those who are saying that, in my view, are saying that incorrectly. No one is claiming to say that psychological safety is the only construct that can be valuable. As we've talked about so far, it's important to be critical, but then to do further research to find answers that we haven't got so far. So I just wanted to kind of mention that as a starting point because I've seen some of those negative, I guess, perceptions around this area. Just because it's a buzzword doesn't mean it doesn't hold value. It definitely does hold value, but we need to just make sure it's researched better and it's thought about in a critical sense.
So on that basis, on the basis of thinking about it from a critical perspective, if people have questions around this, are curious, how can they, if you want to be contacted, how can they contact you? How can, I know you've got Twitter, how can you be followed? And how can people discover your work, mate?
Yeah, so I think my Nottingham Trent University staff profile, if you just type my name in Nottingham Trent University, for example, into Google, you'll come across my staff page, which will have my email address. On LinkedIn as well, on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is Mus Sarkar, Mus being MUS and Sarkar being SARKAR. And the other thing to note is actually, both in terms of the leaders report that we talked about today, but also some of this other kind of academic research into psychological safety. The other place to find that is on ResearchGate. ResearchGate is a community where a lot of academics will put some of their publications on. So if people want to get access to any of these academic work, then either email me or request some of the papers via ResearchGate as well. So we would love people to connect. It'll be great to find out, what resonated with people in this conversation and also other areas of interest as well.
Fantastic. Well, Muz, as always, mate, absolute joy to share your company, to tease the thoughts out of your mind and to have a real rich conversation around these things. So thanks so much for today, mate.
No problem at all. Thanks for the invite.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.